Seasick Love. Alpha Mated Book 5, A Werewolf Shifter Romance. Written by Flynn. 1. Who knew I'd get to meet death before the week was out? I sure didn't expect that relationship to develop, at least not so soon, but fate was funny. At least that's what death told me. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. It had been a week since David and my last run-in with adventure. I lay on the fall browning of his massive lawn and stared up at the grey skies. The clouds lazily floated by, and my thoughts did the same. A face came into view and blocked mine. I frowned at David's smiling countenance. "Do you mind? I'm deep in thought." He chuckled. "Then I've come at a good time." He dropped a folded slip of sleek paper onto my face. I sputtered and sat up. The paper slipped into my lap. "You could kill somebody with that paper cut," I snapped. David took a seat beside me and nodded at the paper. "What do you think? Not a bad idea for a pre-honeymoon honeymoon, huh?" I glanced down and furrowed my brow. It was a cruise brochure. I looked to David. "Weren't you traumatized on your last cruise?" I pointed out. He shrugged. "I got over it." I arched an eyebrow. "Mostly." I snorted and took up the brochure. "I guess since you're not chasing your food, that's a good sign." I opened the folded paper and broached the brochure. It showed the usual advertisements of a crowded swimming pool, indoor tennis courts that made my calves cramp just thinking about it, overpriced food and nightly entertainment sure to enrapture the kids and bore the adults. I tried to fold the brochure back to its small position, but the dark arts kept the damn thing from going back. Are these cruises really any fun? I wondered as I wrestled with the paper. David took the brochure from me and folded the parts in one try. "They can be a life-changing experience." I glared at him. "Yeah, but I don't want to wake up the next day and find I have even more leg hair to shave." He shrugged and climbed to his feet. "I had hoped you would be more excited, especially as I know the captain." I raised an eyebrow. "What's that got to do with anything?" David tapped the brochure against his palm. "Well, knowing the captain means we get to eat at his table, and we can see every part of the ship. And we're nearly insured tickets to all the good shows. And you get me all to yourself without any of our past, fun adventures." I jumped to my feet and grinned. "When do we leave?" He smiled and offered me his arm. "Tomorrow. The preparations have already been made." The next day found us at the familiar port of the city. Lord Blake's massive yacht sat far off in the distance, but ahead of us was our boat. It was a smaller cruise liner, one capable of touring the bay in 3 days at a leisurely pace. A couple hundred other people waited in eager anticipation for their turn to walk up the large, wide white gangplank that led to the top deck. A large bag was slung over my shoulder, courtesy of David, and he had his own suitcase neatly tucked under one arm. He leaned his head back and admired the ship. The name was painted on the side in large blue letters, Seasick Love. "Quite a magnificent ship, isn't she?" he commented. I looked up at the name and wrinkled my nose. "Reminds me of seasickness." He turned and smiled at me. "I hope you don't suffer from that malady." I shrugged. "I don't know. The longest I've been on a boat was a dinghy in the middle of a lake. It took a friend and me 12 hours to catch our limit, but we did it." "And what was the limit?" "A fish per person." He chuckled. "The fish god was not with you. Or any other one." We thought about sacrificing one of us to get that last fish, but by that time we caught a fish and realized we'd reached our limit with one of us overboard. "I'm glad you weren't the one sacrificed," he told me. I snorted. "So am I. Anyway, when do we get aboard this floating turkey?" He offered me his arm. "Right now." I accepted his arm, and he led me to the sign-in station. A quick registration, and we walked up the gangplank. Colorful movement caught my eyes on the docks. I glanced over my shoulder, and saw it was a troupe of performers in their bright outfits. A man in a tall black hat and a red coat with tails, the ringleader of the gang, met my eyes. He tipped his hat and smiled at me. I looked away. There was something about that smile I didn't like. We reached the deck and turned right onto a long walkway. I paused at the railing and looked down. The distance was a couple dozen feet into the deep, dark water. My head was hit with a wave of nausea. I clutched my head and swayed from side to side. David caught my arms and kept me still. "Are you all right?" he asked me. I straightened and nodded. "Yeah. Just a little farther down there than I thought." A young man in a white suit greeted us with a smile and a bow. "Mr. and Mrs. Dives?" I whipped my head to David. He smiled at the young man and nodded. "That's us. The captain has asked me to personally look after both of you. My name is Stuart." David shook hands with him. "It's nice of the captain to treat us with such hospitality, but if I know Captain John Ducks, I'm sure that wasn't the reason he sent you to us." Stuart smiled. "Can I be frank, sir? Is that your first name?" The young man's smile widened. "May I be honest with you, sir?" "Perfectly honest, but not here." "Why don't you lead us to our stateroom, and there you can spill your heart to us?" David suggested. Stuart bowed his head, and led us into the bowels of the ship. Our stateroom lay on one of the upper floors, so it was a few short flights of stairs to the room. I found it to be like a small condo with all the amenities, except a cooking kitchen. There was a fridge for drinks and room service food, and a small dining area at which to eat it. The living room had a couch, chair and TV, and the master suite had a jacuzzi tub. A balcony off the living room had a great view of the docks, and a small half bath off the living room finished the decor. David turned to Stuart, and gestured to the living room. "Care to sit down, Stuart?" The young man smiled but shook his head. "I can't, sir. I have to report you're coming to the captain, and see to some other guests." David dropped his arm and shrugged. "Ah well. What about that honesty you were going to tell us?" Stuart blushed. "To be honest, sir, the captain has me watching you too well, in his own words, so the other passengers can breathe safely." "Do you happen to know what he means by that, sir?" David chuckled. "Just that he knows my penchant for trouble following me, that's all." Stuart furrowed his brow. "I hope this won't be serious, sir." David arched an eyebrow. "Why is that?" "Well, there was some trouble with theft and attacks on an ocean liner he commanded some months ago on which I served. It was an older and larger sister to this ship, but part of the same fleet. There was quite a strange air about the whole mystery that was never quite resolved." David slung his arm across Stuart's shoulder, and turned our steward towards the door. He guided the young man to the entrance, and patted him on the back. "I assure you there will be no thefts aboard this ship so long as I'm aboard." Stuart smiled. "I'm glad to hear it, sir. If you'll both excuse me." He hurried out to attend to his other charges. David turned to me with a furrowed brow. I frowned. "I don't like that look." He walked over to me and paused to cup his chin in one hand. "I doubt a slight case of burglary is what's bothering the captain." I groaned and plopped myself onto a cushion of the couch. "You promised me an adventure-free time." He dropped his hand and smiled at me. "I promise there won't be any strange, unexplained thefts while we're here." The couch faced the TV and the wall with the balcony. Movement behind him caught my eye, and I looked past David at the large sliding glass door. A flailing boy hung off the railing. 2. I jumped to my feet and pointed at the balcony. "David." David spun around and splayed his fingers. His fingernails were lengthened before he realized the trouble. He clenched his fists and raced to the sliding door. The boy, a lad of about 10, tried to pull himself up, but one of his hands slipped. He fell back, and I saw his fingers slide slowly off the railing. David flung open the door and leapt out. He caught the boy's hand just as his short fingers slipped over the edge. David pulled him over the railing and set him on the ground. The boy pushed David away and scooted to the far corner of the balcony. The stranger's wide eyes flickered from David to me as I approached the open door.
It gave me time to see the boy was clothed in rags, and his disheveled brown hair covered his eyes.
A distinct odor wafted from his dirty person. David knelt on the ground and held out his hand to the boy.
"We won't hurt you."
David shuffled closer. The boy pressed farther into the corner. David dropped his arm.
"What's your name?"
The boy clamped his mouth shut and shook his head. A pounding on the door alerted us to more trouble.
"Is anyone in there?"
A gruff voice shouted. David stood and strode past me, but not before he partially shut the curtains to hide our guest. He reached the door and opened it to reveal 3 ship employees. 2 stood behind a burly fellow with dark eyes and a heavy beard.
"I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but there's been reports of a stowaway climbing the balconies," the burly man informed him. "We were wondering if you've seen him. He's a boy of about 10 dressed in some ratty clothes."
My eyes flickered to the young man. His eyes were wide, and his knees were brought up against his chest with his arms wrapped around them.
He didn't breathe.
David tilted his head back and squinted his eyes as he rubbed his chin.
"A boy of 10 in ratty clothes.
Can't say I've seen that combination lately." The employee bowed his head.
"Well, if you see him, can you please alert any of the crew?"
David smiled and nodded.
"Of course. And happy hunting."
The men left and David shut the door. He strode over to the sliding glass door and peeked around the corner at the boy.
"You're safe for now, but not if you stay out here where people can see you."
The boy frowned but slowly uncurled himself. We stepped into the suite and the boy reluctantly followed. David shut the door behind him and drew the rest of the curtains to shut out prying eyes. My eyes flickered to David.
"So, what are you planning on doing with a stowaway?" "I'm not a stowaway," the boy piped up.
David held out his hand to the boy.
"Then do you mind if we see your ticket?"
The boy sullenly looked at the ground.
"I don't have one."
David folded his arms and studied the boy.
"You know, I could pull some strings with the captain. He's a friend of mine."
The boy lifted his head and stared wide-eyed at David. David swept his eyes over the boy's ragged appearance.
"Of course, you'll have to agree to some changes."
"If anybody sees you in that, they'll definitely think you're a stowaway." The boy looked down at his clothes.
"What's wrong with him?"
David chuckled.
"You're wearing the official attire of a street urchin, my friend."
"By the by, what is your name? We can't exactly keep in calling you boy or hey you." The boy glared at him.
"It's Oliver, and get it into your heads now that I ain't gonna be called Ollie, got it?"
David arched an eyebrow, but the crooked grin on his lips didn't leave.
"All right, Oliver. What made you climb our balcony?"
Oliver's eyebrows crashed down.
"What do you mean by that?"
"I got stuck in the room beneath this one, and when I heard the people in there call for those white shirts, I needed some place to go." David nodded at the sliding glass door.
"Our balcony is on one of the highest floors, and there are several floors lower that would have been easier to climb down to."
David leaned down and met Oliver's eyes.
"So why climb up?"
Oliver squirmed in his seat and averted his eyes.
"I just climbed, okay? I wasn't thinking about which way."
David straightened and dropped his arms to his sides.
"All right, we'll drop the subject for now. What's more important right now is that you get a bath before the white shirts follow your scent back to our room."
Oliver whipped his head to David and glared at him.
"I'm not gonna be here for long, and I ain't taking a hay."
David had stepped to the back of the couch and picked the young boy up by his armpits. He hugged Oliver's back to his chest and carried him above the ground towards the master suite. Oliver kicked and squirmed.
"Let me go.
Let me go.
This is harassment." "You can take it up with the captain, but after we're through," David replied.
I followed the indignation parade to the bathroom and watched David drop the young boy into the large tub. Oliver tried to scramble out, but David pushed him back and turned one of the handles. Hot, steaming water poured from the faucet and filled the tub.
"I'm still wearing my clothes," Oliver pointed out. "They need a cleaning too," David replied.
I leaned against the open doorway and folded my arms.
"Do I need to separate you boys?"
David grabbed the collar of Oliver's shirt and pulled it off the young lad. It revealed his pale skeletal frame, and I cringed when I saw long cut marks down his chest and sides. David dropped the shirt into the water and knelt in front of the tub. His eyes swept over the scarred wounds before they flickered to Oliver. The young boy ducked into the rising water and covered himself with his arms.
"What are you looking at?" "I wish you'd tell us," David returned.
Oliver turned his face away and pursed his lips.
"They're nothing." "That's a lot of pain there for nothing," David countered.
Oliver sank lower into the water. Steam dampened his oily hair. David sighed and stood.
He turned to me and jerked his thumb at the young boy. "Mind taking care of him while I go to the captain?"
"His men need to be told to stop their wild goose chase."
"Yeah, the scrawny turkey's been found," I quipped as I looked past him at the boy. "But what am I supposed to do with him?" "Put him in front of the TV."
David half turned to Oliver, who watched us with narrowed eyes.
"He won't really be recognizable when he's clean, so you two could tour the ship. I'll find you when I'm done with the captain and give you the grand tour." "I might be able to show her around for a price," Oliver spoke up.
David arched an eyebrow.
"Aren't you a little young for a cruise director?"
Oliver glared at him.
"This ain't the first time I snuck aboard something like this, so I know my way around."
David turned to me.
"It's up to you." I shrugged. "Why not? He can't get me any more lost than I could on my own, and he'll earn the cleaning with it."
"Hey, don't I get a say in this stupid cleaning?" asked our drowned rat. David returned his attention to the waif and smiled.
"No."
He turned away and strode towards the door but paused beside me. His tense gaze caught mine.
"If there's trouble, call me." I arched an eyebrow. "How? I don't have your phone number."
A sly smile slipped onto his lips and he tapped his ear.
"Just give a yell."
"I'll hear you." And with that he left, leaving me with a pre-honeymoon vacation without a pre-groom, and a mess of trouble in form of a skinny wet boy in the tub.
I glanced at the waif. He glared at me. At least I think he glared at me.
I leaned towards him and squinted.
"You need your hair cut."
"You look like a shaggy dog." Oliver parted his hair so I could see his eyes.
"I ain't gonna have you cut my hair." I shrugged. "Good, because then you'd look like a dog with mange, but I think I saw a barbershop listed on one of the brochures." He raised his arms.
Water dripped off in long waterfalls.
"I'm not going nowhere like this. They'll catch me for sure." "Let me see what we've got in your size," I told him.
I stepped back into the bedroom and rummaged through David's suitcase. Splashing noises came from the bathroom, and in a few seconds Oliver appeared in the doorway. The young boy was hunched over and his hair covered his eyes. A white towel was wrapped around his skinny midsection, and he dripped all over the floor. He pushed the hair out of his way and scowled at me.
"I'm clean enough. You got those clothes yet?" I held up a small dress shirt and pants. "These will take some tucking and magic with pins, but we should get them to work."
He wrinkled his nose.
"I ain't wearing those." "Good, because you are," I quipped. "Now hold still, and this torture will be over quickly for both of us."
3. The young ragamuffin was duly dressed and presented in front of a mirror.
He stuck his tongue out at his appearance. I look stupid.
I rolled my eyes and turned him away from the distasteful reflection.
We'll get you something else later. You promised to show me the ship, right? He shrugged. I guess. What do you want to see first?
I mimicked his shrug.
I don't know. What's a good place to see?
He furrowed his brow and tapped his chin.
Well, his eyes flickered to me. There is the stage. That's a big swanky place where all the performances are. I smiled at him and swept my hand towards the bedroom door. Sounds interesting. Lead the way.
Oliver led me through the maze of halls to one of the upper floors. The stage theatre was close to a film theatre, and both shared a grand lobby with a concession stand and stairway access to the balconies in the play theatre. The stairs were roped off with a sign that read, "No entrance." The faint sounds of a rehearsal drifted through the closed theatre doors. Oliver tugged on my arm and pointed at the flight of stairs.
Let's go up there. I frowned. We're not supposed to. He scoffed. I ain't even supposed to be on this ship, so let's go.
The lobby was empty, so we had no troubles ducking under the rope and climbing the stairs. Oliver opened the door and presented us with a darkened balcony filled with shadows of chairs. We tiptoed down the row of chairs and stopped at the bottom. The balcony was circular and rose some 30 feet off the floor. We were about 70 feet from the stage.
Not quite nosebleed, but close enough.
The colorful group of people from the docks were on the stage. Some practiced magic acts with black hats and cards. Others, like a bearded lady, strutted the stage. A man on stilts that were covered with baggy pants strolled the planks. It was a menagerie of strange. I leaned forward and squinted.
I wish I had a pair of those glasses. Like these.
Oliver and I spun around. The first row of seats stood behind us, and in one of them sat the smiling man in red and black. A pair of the opera spectacles dangled from two of his fingers. He stood and clasped the glasses in his hand as he studied us.
I don't recall anyone being allowed up here during rehearsals, he commented. We ain't done nothing wrong, Oliver spoke up.
The man's smile widened.
Of course not. And as a sign that I mean you no ill will for your intrusion, I offer you this.
He reached into his coat and pulled out a slip of paper which he held out to me.
I didn't reach for it. What is it? A ticket to our show.
His eyes flickered from Oliver to me.
Unfortunately, I only have one to spare.
I grabbed Oliver's hand and tugged him towards the path between the seats.
Thanks, but no thanks.
The man stepped into our path and held out the card again.
His smile was strained. I insist.
Oliver leaned forward and snatched the ticket. I glared at the boy, but he shrugged. The man's smile widened before he bowed and stepped out of our way. We got the hell out of there and didn't stop until we reached a nearby corridor. I leaned against the wall and took a deep breath.
That guy is creepy as hell.
Oliver stood beside me and shrugged.
I guess he's pretty weird.
I glanced down at the slip of colorful paper in his hand.
Let me see that. He handed it to me, and I studied the contents.
The small piece of paper had a bunch of colorful balloons and a stage. A few words were written in black across the picture of the stage. I read aloud the title of the show.
Tenor Magicae.
I wrinkled my nose.
What does that mean? Magnificent magic, Oliver spoke up. I glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. How'd you know that?
He looked away and shrugged.
Guess I heard it somewhere. Oh.
I returned my attention to the card and frowned. The thing reminded me too much of the man in red.
I held the card out to Oliver. I guess this is yours. He shook his head. I don't want it. I frowned. But you took it. He glared at me. I changed my mind, all right. I don't want the stupid thing. I sighed and tucked the card into my pocket. Fine. Now where do we... I noticed he brushed his hair out of his eyes. I think the next stop should be the barber shop. He snarled at me. I ain't taking you there.
I grabbed his hand and dragged him down the hallway.
Good, because I know the way from here. He squirmed and dug his heels into the floor. I ain't going. I'd rather die. Then I'll have the barber cut your hair before you're put into the coffin, I quipped.
Seeing he couldn't win, Oliver accepted his fate with as much grace and dignity as a mole rat in a tuxedo. The barbershop was located in the shopping mall area of the ship, where 3 floors surrounded a central, open-roofed courtyard. A railing and wide walkway separated the fronts of the shops from an inevitable death, into a flower garden and fountain surrounded by a rock tile floor. We arrived at the barbershop sans Oliver's dignity, and he was placed in the high chair for his execution.
That's where David found us a half hour later.
He stepped into the shop and swept his eyes over the scene.
I sat in a chair against the wall with a forgotten magazine in my lap.
My attention was focused on the barber and his victim. Oliver sat as stiff and white as a corpse in the chair, and beneath him on the floor was a pile of hair large enough to make a wig. David took a seat beside me and nodded at the boy.
He doesn't look too happy. Like a cat in a bath, I quipped. So how did the rest of the tour go? He wondered. I shrugged. We haven't been that many places. Just the theatre area and here.
I studied him.
But how'd the talk with the captain go?
David smiled and nodded at Oliver.
It seems we can keep our pet, provided he doesn't break any rules or at least gets caught breaking them. He can sleep on the couch in our suite.
I sighed and tossed the magazine back onto the table beside me.
Some honeymoon. He chuckled. Just think of it as future experience. I turned and furrowed my brow. What's that supposed to mean?
His eyes sparkled.
Well, I was meaning to tell you. I ain't taking any more of this.
The rowdy racket came from our ornery orphan. Oliver tore the towel off his chest and hopped off the chair. He leaned forward and ruffled his short hair to give it a frazzled look, and lifted his head to glare at the barber.
I ain't letting you take any more.
The barber glanced at me and pointed his scissors at the boy.
Mom. I sighed and nodded. It's fine. How much do I owe you?
The barber smiled and shook his head.
Nothing.
The amenities of the ship are added into the bill for the ticket. Oliver spun around to glare at me.
You owe me big for this. I stood with David and grinned. Come on. You don't look that bad. You still owe me, he insisted. How about some lunch?
David suggested. Oliver crossed his arms and nodded.
That'll do for a start.
We stepped out of the shop and took a right towards the stairs and elevators. The food court was on the bottom floor of the courtyard. Something out of the corner of my eye caught my attention. I paused and looked towards the railing to my right. My eyes widened as I glimpsed the fingers of a small hand, as they desperately clung to the bottom of the floor. A head peeked over and revealed the terrified eyes of a boy child. Their face dropped back out of sight, and the tips of their fingers slid a little closer to the edge.
David!
I yelled as I rushed to the railing.
I hit the slim beam and leaned over. The child was gone. That's when I felt a hard hand push against the center of my back, and I flew over the top of the railing into the abyss.
4.
I screamed and flailed for some hold. A hand caught mine and stopped my drop.
I whipped my head up and found myself staring into David's pale face. He pulled me over the railing. My shaky knees gave out and I collapsed onto the floor. David knelt beside me as a small crowd congregated around us. He grasped my trembling hand and caught my eyes.
Are you okay?
My head spun and my stomach did a couple of flips. I swallowed the lump in my throat and the pain in my stomach, and nodded.
What happened? He asked me. I I don't know, I replied. Excuse me. Please let me through, a voice called in the crowd.
A female employee in white broke through the front of the crowd and hurried to kneel in front of me.
Are you hurt? I shook my head. No, just a little shaken. She looked to David. Can you tell me what happened? He shook his head. I'm not sure. She ran to the railing. I started up and whipped my head to the railing. There was a kid there. He was hanging on the edge. I tried to get up, but David held me down. There wasn't anybody there, he told me. I turned and glared at him. But I saw him.
He was clinging to the floor and slipping. The woman studied me and pursed her lips.
Perhaps it's the shock. I turned my fury on her. I wasn't imagining things.
I really saw him.
Is that what made you go over the railing? You tried to reach for the boy, the woman guessed. I shook my head. No. Somebody pushed me.
I whipped my head to David and frowned.
Why'd you push me?
He started back and his eyes widened.
I didn't push you. I was a few feet away when you seemed to lurch over the railing. Somebody pushed me.
I persisted.
Maybe we should get her to the infirmary, the woman suggested.
I brushed away their hands and stood on my shaky legs.
I'm fine, really.
I looked over my shoulder at the railing and furrowed my brow.
I guess I just slipped or something.
David followed my gaze and frowned.
Or something. I heard him whisper.
The employee grasped my arms and leaned forward to catch my gaze.
Miss, I really think you should. What's the trouble here?
We all turned to see a tall gentleman stride towards us. The man was on the right side of 50 with graying hair, temples, and a stern but kind face. He wore a dark blue uniform with a name tag on the breast. His eyes swept over our little group and the spectators. His gaze fell on David.
What's happened?
David nodded at me.
My wife had a slight spill, that's all, Captain Ducks. She fell over the railing, Captain, the woman spoke up.
The man frowned.
I see. Is she all right? I'm fine, but I am getting hungry, I told him. The corners of his lips twitched up.
Before you eat, would you come with me and make a detailed verbal report? David removed me from the woman's grasp and smiled at the captain.
Of course. Lead the way.
We left the woman behind, and the captain led the three of us to the floor below the top deck. We passed a flight of stairs to the bridge and entered a nearby door. The room was a large suite of some 1,000 square feet, with all the amenities of home, including a fully stocked fridge and kitchen with pantry. The captain offered us the couch and a chair in the living room, and took a seat himself in a chair.
He clasped his hands together and sighed.
David, I requested you remain out of sight for the duration of this trip. David shook his head.
It wasn't our intention to be noticed. And so quickly, the captain added.
His attention fell on me. Could you tell me what exactly happened? I shrugged and related the child I saw, and the push over the edge. By the time I was done, the captain looked disturbed.
It seems my bad luck comes in threes.
David arched an eyebrow.
Threes?
The captain nodded.
Yes. I heard from Stuart that he related to you an episode some months back, but he wasn't present for the unusual occurrences on a voyage I manned a year ago.
David straightened and frowned.
What happened?
The captain cleared his throat.
There was a couple involved there, a wealthy couple.
They had booked passage on the liner as a second honeymoon. The second day of the cruise, a message came to me. The woman had fallen over the railing in the central courtyard.
Was she pushed by something too? I spoke up. He turned his face to me and met my gaze. We didn't have a chance to ask her. The fall killed her. I felt the color drain from my face.
David squeezed my hand.
Go on.
The captain leaned back in his chair and shrugged.
That's really all there is to tell. The husband left the ship after the investigation. We chalked it up to an accident and left it at that.
Besides the circumstances of the attack, is there anything else the same as the last incident? David questioned him.
The captain shook his head. I can't really recall, but learning what you told me, I'll make inquiries into the last ship and see what I can find.
His eyes fell on Oliver, who sat quietly listening to the conversation.
In the meantime, you might want to stay out of trouble, or I'll be forced to take charge of your young guest.
David stood and nodded.
We'll make sure to stay out of trouble.
Thanks for your help, Captain. Captain Duck stood and shook David's hand.
Anything for a friend.
And good luck with your little friend there. Anybody who can climb balconies like him is bound to be a handful. David smiled and bowed his head.
Thanks. We'll keep that in mind.
David led Oliver and me from the captain's quarters and in the direction of our own suite.
I glanced at him.
His lips were pursed and he had a hard, faraway look in his eyes.
I squeezed his hand. What's wrong? You look like I'm already a ghost.
David's eyes flickered to Oliver, who followed along behind us. He lowered his voice to a whisper only I could hear.
I smelled no one near you. I blinked at him. When?
David shook his head and pressed a finger to his lips. We reached our room and walked inside. David turned to Oliver and sniffed the air.
You smell cleaner, but I think you need one last hard scrub behind the ears.
Oliver glared at him.
Says who? Says me.
David swept him into his arms and carried the struggling waif into the bathroom. He dropped the young boy so Oliver landed in front of the toilet. David stepped back and shut the bathroom door.
Now don't come out until you're cleaner.
Oliver jiggled the knob, but David held on to the other side.
Let me out. I could, but you're just going to see us smooching, David warned him.
The jiggling stopped.
Then let me out of these rooms. You just stay nice and quiet in there for a few minutes and we'll tell you when we're done, David promised.
David turned to me and led me to the opposite side of the suite. I jerked my head towards the bathroom.
What's that? He pressed a finger against my lips.
David lowered his voice so I could barely hear him.
Absolutely.
I don't believe in coincidences, and it's no coincidence we're stuck with this kid. I pushed away his finger and frowned.
So what are you saying? And what was that about smelling people earlier? I didn't smell anyone around you when I saw you pushed, he revealed. I arched an eyebrow. Not even a phantom. He shook his head. No, but I glimpsed an indent in your back where a hand pressed against your shirt. That tells me we're dealing with something otherworldly.
I grimaced.
And us without Kosho. I can reach him by phone and ask him about this.
Meanwhile, you need to be very careful.
I snorted. With some invisible thing you can't smell and nobody can see trying to kill me. You'd have to lock me in a padded cell. He shook his head. I wouldn't trust the pads, not with this curse. I frowned. So you think it's a curse?
David shrugged.
It's my best guess, but Kosho will know more. I sighed and ran a hand through my hair. Hopefully we learn that more before I'm more or less dead.
David grasped my hands and looked me in the eyes.
I won't let anything else happen to you. I smiled and squeezed his hands.
Good, because I'd come back and haunt you, and I'd guarantee even Doc couldn't exorcise me.
He chuckled. I wouldn't want him to.
A small fist banged the bathroom door.
Are you two done being stupid?
David looked past me at the bathroom door.
We are, but are you? I ain't stupid. I snorted. Well, I guess that proves it.
David strode over to the bathroom door and opened it. Oliver stumbled out and glared at him.
I'll sue you for kidnapping. Then we'll be side by side receiving our punishment, my little stowaway, David quipped.
Oliver frowned and shuffled over to the center of the living room.
You think you're real smart, don't ya?
David followed behind him with a smile on his lips.
I've been around the world a few times. So have I, so don't go thinking I don't know why ya shoved me in there, Oliver snapped.
David folded his arms and studied the young boy.
So why did I shove you in there?
Oliver jerked his head towards me.
You wanted to talk to her about something, and ya didn't want me overhearing it.
David chuckled.
You've pretty much got it right. But how about you set aside your paranoia for 1 second, and take a look at this?
David picked up a piece of paper and tossed it at Oliver. The young boy looked down at the paper and back at David.
What's this?
David strode over to the kitchen and took a soda from the fridge.
The room service food list. Our little adventure interrupted lunch, remember?
Oliver held the paper close to his face and squinted his eyes. He pulled away and tossed the paper away.
I just want a hamburger.
I plucked the paper from the floor and glanced at the menu.
What kind of hamburger? They have a dozen styles. He shrugged. I don't know. What kinds they got? I held the paper out to him. See for yourself.
He pursed his lips and turned his head away from me.
I can't. I arched an eyebrow. Why not? He shrank into himself. Because I can't. You can't what?
I persisted. He whipped his head around to face me. Because I can't read, okay?
I blinked at him. Not even English. Are you stupid?
I can't read nothing, he snapped. He plopped himself on the couch and crossed his arms.
I don't need to read anyway.
David and I glanced at each other. My mate cleared his throat.
Well, we'll order for you, and maybe when this is over we'll see to your education.
Oliver's narrowed eyes flickered to David.
What's that supposed to mean?
David took the paper from me and studied the contents.
It means I want you to know how to read your own menu, so we don't have to do it for you.
Oliver arched an eyebrow.
I ain't following.
David chuckled. To put it bluntly, I'll see if I can't get you into a good school so you can learn to read. You might even learn to write. Oliver's eyes widened and he blinked at David.
You'd really do that for me?
David shrugged.
Why not?
The young boy frowned.
You're just fooling me, ain't ya?
David shook his head and tossed the paper onto the table.
Nope, but we can talk more about this after the cruise, and after lunch. And then? I asked him. He smiled. Then you two will stay in the nice confines of these safe room while I do some sleuthing. I marched over and stuck my face in his, or at least tried to. Like hell you are.
I'm going. He pressed a finger against my lips.
It was then I noticed the sad look in his eyes.
He slipped his finger off my lips and spoke in a soft whisper.
I don't know what I would do if I lost you, and I don't want to take that risk, not until I find out something that will help us.
I sighed and my shoulders slumped.
Fine, but don't do anything stupid without me, okay? He smiled and nodded. Agreed. What about me?
Oliver piped up.
He stood on the couch and glared at us. Don't I get a say in this stuff?
David and I glanced at one another, and then back at Oliver.
No.
5. We all ordered hamburgers and ate. The rest of the afternoon was passed peacefully exploring the room, and enjoying the bay view from the safe side of the sliding glass door, as the cruise ship sailed the calm waters. At early evening, Oliver and I sat opposite each other in the living room when David swept into the room. He'd been missing for several hours, and had a wide smile on his face.
So have any luck on your sleuthing? I asked him. I've set up some lifelines which I hope will bear fruit, but in the meantime why don't all three of us enjoy some more quality time? I arched an eyebrow. What did you have in mind?
By going to the theater, he suggested as he plopped himself down on the couch beside Oliver. The young boy wrinkled his nose.
I ain't going to some stupid show. Good, because I'm not taking you to a show, I'm taking you to the theater, David corrected him.
I cringed.
Does that mean I have to go too?
David closed his eyes and shook his head as he clucked his tongue.
Is there no class in this suite but for me? I glared at him. There's plenty of class, but of the lowly type, which is why I want to stay here. Besides, what about earlier?
Awareness of the danger negates some of the risk, and I will be keeping a close eye on you, he promised. David gave me a sly smile as his eyes swept over me. Besides, why would we want to ruin the opportunity for you to wear that beautiful dress I bought you?
I arched an eyebrow. What dress?
He jerked his head towards the bedroom door.
It's on the bed. I had it delivered while we were out having our little adventure.
His eyes fell on Oliver.
There's something for you too.
The young boy sneered at him.
What did I want with some clothes?
David shrugged.
Probably very little, but I forgot to mention there's a surprise waiting in each of your attire.
Oliver and I glanced at each other. We both jumped from our seats and raced each other to the bedroom. Oliver got the door open, but I caught up to him.
Our slim bodies got stuck in the doorway for a few seconds before we toppled onto the floor.
We stumbled to the foot of the bed, where our evening clothes, a white cocktail dress and a penguin suit, awaited us. Atop each one was a white envelope. Oliver and I tore them open and our mouths dropped open. Inside was a ticket to the theater for that night's play. I whipped my head to the doorway and watched David reach the bedroom door.
I held up the ticket and glared at him. This is a dirty trick.
David leaned against the doorframe and grinned.
I thought it was quite clean myself. Definitely dirty, I insisted.
I tossed the ticket onto the bed and paused for a moment before I turned back to David.
If you already had the tickets, then what have you been doing? Let's just say I've had some news from our good captain, he commented. He glanced at his watch. But it looks like that will have to wait. Our play awaits, and if anyone wants to eat, then I suggest you come with me.
He turned away but paused and glanced over his shoulder at us.
That sly grin of his spread across his lips. Oh, and I've instructed room service to ignore all pleas for food, just in case either of you had the idea of holding up in the suite.
Oliver and my shoulders slumped, and we glared at him.
He chuckled and walked away. Hurry now. The play starts in half an hour.
Oliver and I reluctantly slipped into our attire. I was the second to change, and as I slipped off my jeans, something fluttered to the ground. I picked it up and cringed. It was the ticket to the magic show. The date on the card showed it was to be held tomorrow night.
That was another show I'd be glad to miss.
I tossed the ticket onto the bed and threw my jeans over the top. In a few minutes I finished dressing and stepped out of the bedroom. David and Oliver stood on the opposite side of the room. I caught the tail end of the low conversation with Oliver's part.
And that's all I know. What's all you know? I spoke up.
David whipped his head to me and smiled as he strode over to me.
He clasped my hands in his and studied me. You look lovely.
I looked past him at Oliver. The young boy stared at an interesting spot on the floor. My eyes flickered back to David.
What were you two talking about? He shook his head. Nothing important. Let me change and we can go to the show.
David suited himself in a penguin outfit, and we set out on our way. David kept my arm locked in his firm hold as we traveled to the theater from earlier. A crowd of people similarly attired flowed into the open theater doors. I looked around for my smiling friend and was relieved to see no one. Oliver scowled at all the fancy-dressed people.
Why are we hanging around with all these pansy people?
Several of the pansy people caught his words and sneered at the young boy. David leaned towards our young charge, but kept his eyes on the sneering folk.
Don't upset the wildlife, son.
They bite with gold teeth. The people turned away and hurried through the open doors. David directed us to the balcony stairs, and we took our seat at the front. Oliver sat on David's left, while I occupied his right. People congregated in the aisles and around their seats, as they chatted like so many sparrows. The lights dimmed soon after we took our seats, and the rest of the audience took theirs. The room dimmed but for the lights on the stage.
I jumped when I felt a hand touch mine. "It's only me," David whispered.
The curtains rose and we were presented with a picture of swashbucklers with their swords and pistols dueling. I leaned towards him and lowered my voice to a whisper.
"What are we watching?" "The Three Musketeers," David answered. I snorted. "Sounds classical." He chuckled. "It's very lively." "While these guys duel, mind telling me what you were up to this afternoon?" I asked him. "After the performance," he promised. There almost wasn't an after the performance, for me.
One of the lead actors, the portly one, pulled out his pistol and aimed at an enemy. The enemy grabbed his arm and turned the pistol towards the balcony. The pistol fired, but there wasn't the usual bang of a fake discharge. David tackled me to the floor, a split second before the speeding bullet hit the back of my seat. The audience around us leapt from their chairs and sang out in a chorus of screams. Someone flipped the lights on. The lower audience joined them in a screaming frenzy, as the manager of the play ran on stage. He held his arms over his head, and his booming voice rang over the audience. "Please remain calm. Please, ladies and gentlemen, remain in your seats and remain calm." Several ushers raced over to us just as David sat me up. His eyes held a yellow tinge in their depths as he clasped my shaking hands.
"Are you okay?"
I nodded.
"Why, yeah, I think so."
The manager of the theater knelt beside us.
"Are either of you hurt?"
David shook his head.
"No, we're fine, but what happened?"
The manager shook his head.
"I can't say, but we'll find out."
He glanced over his shoulder. Two of the ushers inspected my chair.
"What happened?"
One of the ushers pulled a blunted object from the back.
"It looks like a bullet, sir."
The manager stood and took the object.
He turned it over and frowned. What the hell was a real bullet doing in the prop gun?
The usher shrugged.
"I don't know."
The manager pushed through the ushers and marched down the stairs. David helped me to my feet and looked me over.
"We need to find out what happened. Do you need me to carry you?"
I shook my head and gave him a small smile.
"I don't think that'd be a good idea in this dress, so just lead the way."
David glanced at Oliver. His face was pale.
"Did you want to stay here?"
Oliver shook his head.
No, I'll follow." "Then don't fall behind."
David wrapped his arms around me and held me against his side as he hurried through the crowds of audience members and ship employees.
We swept down the stairs and to the lower audience chamber.
The actors congregated on stage and huddled in groups, while the audience stood uneasily in front of their chairs. The theater manager disappeared behind the stage-left curtain. We followed, and found him in a heated discussion with the play manager in the wings. The theater manager nearly shoved the bullet up the other man's nose.
"What the hell is this? Are you trying to get us sued?"
The man shoved the bullet away from his face and glared at his compatriot.
"It was an accident. There weren't supposed to be any real bullets in the guns." "That doesn't fly in lawsuits," the other man growled. "Who loaded the guns?"
David spoke up. The play manager's eyes fell on us, and he frowned.
"No audience members are allowed backstage."
David nodded at me.
"My wife here nearly became part of the play."
The bullet hit her chair. The color drained from the play manager's face.
"She's not injured, is she?"
David shook his head.
"No, but she could have been killed. Now please answer my question."
The manager cleared his throat.
"Well, the prop manager handles the equipment."
She was supposed to load the guns with cheap gunpowder to cause smoke.
And I did, a voice spoke up.
A woman marched out of the depths of the backstage and up to our little group. She put her hands on her hips and glared at the play manager.
Don't try to pin this one on me.
I know I filled all those prop guns with powder.
I don't even have access to bullets on this ship.
Did anyone else have access to the guns at any time? David asked her.
She nodded. For a few hours before the play.
They were left on the prop table, and I didn't have time to watch them every minute. Anyone could have gone up and put the bullet in the chamber.
Mr. Leno, a shrill voice called out.
One of the actors from the play, another musketeer, rushed from the stage. He daintily held the gun in one hand and thrust it into the play manager's face.
This thing's loaded.
Leno grabbed the pistol and glared at the man.
Then don't point it at anyone. And how do you know it's loaded?
The actor pulled something from his pocket and opened his hand. A small bullet lay in his palm.
This dropped out when I pulled my gun from my waist. I could have been killed. Were you supposed to fire your gun in the opening scene?
David questioned him. The actor nodded.
Yes.
Plenty he plays Porthos, both of us were supposed to fire our guns. David looked to Leno.
Was the foe supposed to block that shot as he did?
The manager shook his head.
No.
The actor was supposed to be shot, and the other actor was supposed to be shot as well. He paused and his eyes widened.
You're not insinuating that these bullets were meant to hit the audience, do you? The whole scene was made more complicated when the captain and a few white-suited employees arrived.
His eyes fell on us and he pursed his lips.
I was informed there was a disturbance in the theater. What's happened?
The theater manager gestured to me.
This young woman was nearly hit by a stray bullet. It was an accident, of course. I believe my questions have established that it was not an accident, David interrupted.
The manager glared at him.
I don't think so. Then you're not thinking, David quipped.
The captain held up his hand.
Gentlemen, I think that's enough. He turned to the play manager. Can the play continue?
The manager nodded.
Yes, sir. Then do so and remain here.
Will everyone else directly involved please follow me to the nearest office where we can discuss this in private? 6. It was the second time that day that I felt like we were being sent to the principal's office, but this time it wasn't so swank. The nearest office was a hole in the wall that barely fit our group, made up of one orphan, a werewolf, 2 managers, the captain and little ol' me. The tale was retold for the benefit of the captain, with all the heart-stopping details of my close demise. The captain swept his keen eyes over us and stopped on the prop manager.
Are there any cameras that survey the table where the props were kept? She shrugged. Maybe.
I've never really needed to find out before.
Find out if you would.
He next turned to the theater manager.
Have all the surveillance cameras of the entrances brought to my office, as soon as possible.
The manager nodded.
Sure thing.
Then it was our turn for the harsh eye, especially for David. Since you can't seem to keep out of danger even in a theater, you are confined to your quarters until further notice. David frowned. Keeping us in one room will only help whoever did this reach us.
The captain shook his head. We haven't proven your theory yet, and I'll have a guard posted outside your room until my order is lifted.
Captain, please. Captain Dux held up his hand and shook his head. Any further objections you have can be discussed tomorrow afternoon. For now, he stood from his chair and winced when his back cracked. I need to hand command over to my first mate.
If you manage to find trouble at the late hours, you'll have to speak with him.
David pursed his lips but remained silent. The managers returned to their venue, while a ship officer with a sidearm joined us outside the office. The captain nodded at our little group.
Take them to their room and make sure they don't leave.
The officer saluted the captain and turned to us.
"If you would lead the way to your room, sir."
David led us back to our room. He unlocked the door but paused and turned to our guest with a sly smile.
"We won't hold you to the captain's orders." The man shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir, but I must obey the captain's orders."
"You will remain in your room until the captain says otherwise." David shrugged.
"Can't blame a guy for trying."
He slipped inside, and Oliver and I followed. I dropped my high heels off my feet and slumped down on the couch. David stood beside the coffee table, while Oliver took a seat opposite me. My mate cupped his chin in his hand and furrowed his brow. I leaned back and sighed.
"This might not be so bad. Nothing's happened to me in here."
He dropped his hand and shook his head. "So far, but our foe may learn about our predicament and change their plans accordingly."
"Are we even sure there's a foe involved?" I asked him.
David looked down at me with his eyes tinged with yellow.
"I don't believe," I held up a hand. I know you don't believe in coincidences." I dropped my hand and stood. "Well, if I'm going to be attacked again, I should get some sleep so I have enough energy to scream a lot." "What are you two talking about?" Oliver spoke up.
David's eyes returned to normal, and he turned to our young charge. "Think you can get comfortable on the couch in those clothes?" Oliver looked down at himself and sneered.
"I ain't sleeping in these things." "I suppose there's a first time for everything," David commented as he stepped backwards towards our bedroom.
I beat him to the room. David closed the door behind us and turned to me with a grin on his lips.
"Care for a little fun before you sleep?"
I picked up my jeans and shook my head.
"I don't think I'm quite up to the challenge right now. Almost meeting death does that to me."
David glanced at the foot of the bed. His eyes widened, and he lunged for something on the covers.
He spun around to face me and held up the card. "Where did this come from?" I shrugged. "Some creepy guy gave it to me."
David marched up to me and grabbed my arm.
"Who? What was his name?"
I winced and tried to free my arm.
"I don't know. He didn't say his name. He just gave me the ticket." He narrowed his eyes. "And you accepted it," he snapped. I shrank from his fierce gaze and shook my head. "No."
Oliver took it, and I took it from Oliver. I winced and twisted in his grip.
"David, you're hurting me."
He pursed his lips and released me.
"I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you."
I rubbed the sore spot on my arm and glared at him.
"What's the problem, anyway? I wasn't going to go to the show, and that guy is definitely not my type."
David took a deep breath and caught my gaze.
"What can you tell me about him?" I shrugged. "Not much."
He was big, and had a kind of shadow over his face. The guy looked like he was the leader of some magic troupe from the bad side of the tracks.
"You know, the one with the bearded lady and stuff." He ran a hand through his hair and nodded. "Yeah, I know the one. All too well." I arched an eyebrow. "What does that mean?"
David held up the card so I could see the name of the troupe.
"This is the name of the gang who changed me into a werewolf." I felt the color drain from my face. "You mean that guy?" "Was Phoenix, father of Asina, whom you met on Avalon Island." I shuddered and wrapped my arms around myself.
I remembered that hair-raising meeting all too well. My eyes fell on the card and my heart skipped a beat. I whipped my head up to look into David's face.
"Does that mean that I'm going to change into a werewolf?"
He lowered the card and shook his head.
"No. This card doesn't change people into werewolves."
My pulse raced. His tone didn't give me any hope.
"Then what does it do?" "It curses the person to die by horrible accidents."
I stumbled back like I'd been struck by a lead pipe. David jumped forward and caught me before I crashed to the ground. I clung to him as my wobbly legs trembled. I could hear my knees knock against one another as tears built in my eyes.
I swallowed. Is there any way out of this? He nodded. There are 3 ways out of this curse.
You can give it back to the one who gave it to you. I whipped my head up and my eyes widened.
But that's Oliver,
I pointed out.
Then there are 2 other ways, he assured me. The others are for the creator to accept the card, or for you to break the curse through ritual. I blinked at him. What kind of ritual? He pursed his lips and shook his head. I'm afraid I don't know it.
If Kosho or Doc were here, they might be able to help us, but I doubt I could perform the ritual myself or even find all the ingredients.
The tears pushed out of my eyes and slid down my cheeks. Then does that mean?
David grasped my shoulder and looked into my eyes. A small tense smile lay on his lips.
Don't give up hope just yet. We still have the second option. I swallowed my tears. But how are we going to get him to take it back?
David glanced around the room.
I'm not sure, but we won't have much chance to return his kindness from this suite. He turned to me and held out his hand. Do you still trust me? I smiled and accepted his hand. You know I do.
He slyly grinned and pulled me against his side.
Good. Now let's stay here in this nice, safe room and try to figure out what to do. Even as he said this, he pulled me towards the door.
We reached the entrance. David grabbed the knob and flung open the door. Oliver stumbled into the room.
He caught himself and straightened.
David smiled down at our little imp.
How good of you to join us in our joint escape plan preparations.
Oliver folded his arms and scowled at David.
I wasn't doing nothing wrong. I was just offering my services.
David arched an eyebrow.
What kind of services?
The young boy rubbed his fingernails against his chest and grinned.
I can be a distraction.
David chuckled.
And how do you propose to do that?
Oliver smirked and jerked his head towards the open door.
The same way I did the last time, with a little climbing. But the guard isn't that way, I pointed out. He rolled his eyes. I'll just get into another room and go out into the hallway.
The guy'll see me and try to get me, and then you two can do what you want to do.
And what's that?
David questioned him. Oliver shrugged.
I don't know, and I don't care. If you don't want my help, then that's fine. He turned to leave, but David grabbed his shoulder.
Oliver glanced over his shoulder and frowned. David pursed his lips.
Please.
We need your help. Oliver grinned.
Don't be so serious. I'll help ya.
Oliver led us to the sliding glass door, and past that onto the balcony. He grasped the railing and swung one leg over the side. David grasped his shoulder. Oliver looked over his shoulder and frowned.
What's the big idea?
You want me to go or not? David looked him square in the eyes and his voice was firm.
Whatever happens, remember that we'll help you no matter what.
Do you understand? Oliver pursed his lips but gave a single nod. David released him, and the boy climbed over the railing and down to the lower balcony. He slipped into the lower room and disappeared. David turned to me and sighed.
I guess we'll see how binding a short friendship can be. So you think he'll come back? I asked him. He took my hand and led me to the front door. I'm not really sure, but we'll find out. Hey!
Copper! Oliver's voice yelled from the hallway.
What are you doing outside the room? The guard yelled back. You gotta catch me to find out.
Oliver taunted.
Hey! Get back here.
The guard's footsteps pounded down the hallway away from our room. David opened the door and peeked into the hallway. He glanced over his shoulder and grinned at me.
Remind me to pay him well for his services.
7. David led us back to the theater area. The sounds of the play wafted through the closed doors.
He frowned and lifted his head to sniff the air. Damn it! You can't smell him? I asked him. He pursed his lips and shook his head. No.
He's using the same technique Asina used on Avalon Island, to mask his scent.
Then how are we are?
Something strong tugged on the arm not looped around David's arm. I whipped my head to my left.
Nobody was there.
David looked at me.
What's Dakota? The strange tugging returned and brought some friends.
A pair of hands grabbed my arm and yanked me from David's hold.
It dragged me past the theater and down the hall towards the elevators.
David grabbed my other arm and pulled.
I felt like I was being split into two. Not helping.
I yelped. David stopped his pulling, but the invisible hands didn't. It pulled us to the elevators, where it pressed a button, and one of the doors opened. We stepped inside and the doors closed behind us. The same invisible hand pressed the button, the lowest floor available to the elevators, the cargo hold.
I tried to twist out of the thing's grasp, but it held.
David squeezed my arm, and I looked up at him.
He shook his head. You can't free yourself from this with brute force.
I cringed.
Anyway, your werewolf spit or something can scare it away. I wish that were true, but no.
We were forced to ride the elevator to the last floor. The doors opened and I was pulled into a dark, straight hallway lined with shut doors. Only the emergency red lights gave us light. A door stood open at the end of the passage. I was pulled through with David latched onto my other arm.
Our footsteps echoed in the large pitch-black space.
I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. The invisible hold released me some 5 yards into the area, and I winced when I heard the door slam shut behind us, blocking off all light.
Then the lights flickered on, and I wish they hadn't.
Around us stood the horrible, painted faces of the carnival people. They surrounded us on all sides, and beyond them were towers of tall packed crates with narrow paths between them. The carnival folks' black-ringed eyes stared at us without blinking, and they stood as still as statues. All but one, that is. The man in black stepped from their ranks. David pulled me behind him and narrowed his eyes.
Phoenix.
The man in black stopped 2 yards in front of us.
He swept one arm over his chest and gave a deep bow. At your service, Mr. Dives.
My eyes widened. When Phoenix bowed, he revealed a small figure behind him.
Oliver. I whispered.
The young boy pursed his lips and averted his eyes. Phoenix stepped back to stand even with Oliver, and set a hand on the boy's shoulder.
I must admit I wasn't sure Oliver here would be useful, but placing him in the end, he proved to be very helpful for both of us.
David's eyes narrowed as he studied Oliver.
You tricked us.
Oliver shrugged, but still didn't look at us.
Yeah, so what?
David glared at the young boy.
We trusted you.
Phoenix stepped in front of Oliver, and clucked his tongue as he shook his head.
I'm afraid your trust was misplaced, and now you find yourself in quite the hopeless predicament.
David pulled out the death card and held it out to Phoenix.
Then this truly is yours.
Phoenix chuckled.
Yes, and you can't seriously believe I would accept the curse so easily, do you? He snapped his fingers.
The shadowy puppets around us moved in. The man on stilts grabbed David, and a midget and the bearded lady grabbed me. They pulled us apart, and David was bound in heavy chains. The bearded lady grasped my arms and stood behind me. David narrowed his eyes at Phoenix.
If it's money you want, then I'll pay you. I'll pay you anything you want.
Phoenix sighed and shook his head.
You're still so naive, Mr. Dives.
I can't very well have so many wealthy individuals leave me without payment.
It would start a very bad habit among those I wish to. Blackmail.
David interrupted. Phoenix chuckled.
Among my clients, shall we call them?
I would be out of business very quickly. That is why I must make an example of them, by taking in exchange something very precious to them. He cupped his chin in my hand and studied my face.
You did choose a very pretty little mate, didn't you? But it's only the best for the wealthy, while we honest folk make a hard living.
I wrenched my chin from his hand and glared at him.
You wouldn't know honesty if it bit you in the ass.
Phoenix smiled and stepped over to David. He reached down and picked up the death card from the floor, and straightened to examine it.
Quite an ingenious little trick, isn't it?
A voodoo priest taught me the basic spell, and I added my own little flair to the affair.
Hilarious, I quipped.
Phoenix held the card over his head. The air around the card rippled and became distorted. A few fragments of shadow flickered into view, forming a whole creature that floated above me. My eyes widened as I beheld a scythe-wielding creature of darkness. David struggled in his bindings and tried to lunge at me, but the rest of the gang held him in place.
Dakota.
The bearded lady made a hasty retreat away from me. I stumbled back as the shadowy figure floated towards me.
It raised its scythe over its head. I flung up my arm.
The thing brought its scythe down on me, and all turned to black.
I felt cold.
So very cold.
Something ghosted over my face.
My eyes fluttered open.
I found myself on my back on a hard concrete floor.
Above me was a grey sky of clouds that never moved.
I sat up and blinked.
The world around me was a mess of thick fog.
The cold, thick air moved over me and tingled my skin. I stood and wrapped my arms around me.
The air was deathly cold.
Hello,
I called. I stiffened. A pair of shoes clacked against the hard surface. I whipped my head left and right. A figure in black walked out of the thick fog. My pulse quickened. Phoenix.
But wait. It wasn't Phoenix.
The shadowy figure became focused. It was a man in the black garb of a funeral director. He wore a top hat, and in one hand was a cane. His tails fluttered behind him as he walked over to me and stopped. He was thin and impossibly pale. The brim of his hat covered his eyes, but I could tell he looked me over. A smile curled onto his red lips.
You are rather more well-dressed than my usual fare. I glanced down at myself. I still wore that stupid white dress from the theater. I looked up at him. Your usual fare.
He clasped the cane between his hands and nodded.
Yes.
I received your ticket a half a day ago, and have been waiting. He held up one hand and pinched between two fingers was the death card.
I blinked at him. What are you talking about?
I looked around us and furrowed my brow.
And where are we?
The man swept his arm over the area.
This is the junction between life and death.
My eyes widened.
Are you serious?
His dark eyes fell on me, and for the first time I saw they weren't black. They were red.
Death does not lie.
A wave of deep dark despair washed over me. I gasped and stumbled back. My mortal self recoiled from this immortal being.
I clutched my fast-beating heart. He chuckled. You needn't touch your heart. It no longer beats. I narrowed my eyes. Of course it beats.
I can feel it right now.
He swept his hand over me.
The beating in my chest ceased. I looked down and gaped at my chest.
What you felt was only an echo of your body's response to my presence, he told me. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded at him. Then you're. He bowed to me. Death. I felt the color drain from my face. Or rather, I thought I felt it. I stretched out my hands and looked at them. Then I'm very much dead, he confirmed.
I slid onto my knees and stared dumbly at the grey concrete floor.
Dead.
I raised my hands and looked at their lively skin.
I'm really dead.
Death walked up to me and set the bottom of his cane a half-foot in front of me on the floor.
Yes. I closed my eyes and shook my head. I knew I'd end up here sometime, but not like this. Not this soon.
I am rather unpredictable, though in your case the end was rather predictable, he commented. I tilted my head back to look into his red eyes.
Isn't there anything I can do?
Death shook his head.
There is nothing you can do.
My arms dropped to my side and I stared down at the white floor. Death swept his red eyes over me, and a grin slipped onto his red lips.
However, there is something that can be done. My heart would have beat if it could. What? What is it? He held up his hand. Patience.
I will explain.
He held the card up. Do you know what this card does?
I nodded.
Yeah, it kills me.
In its basic form, yes, but there are certain rules that must be followed.
The curse cannot extend to another person.
If anyone is killed with the cursed person, the curse is broke and both souls are saved from me.
He chuckled. At least for the present time. I frowned. But nobody else died with me.
He smiled and pointed the tip of his cane at my stomach. A very innocent soul did die with you.
I looked down at my gut and back at Death. Come again. He arched an eyebrow. That creepy smile never slipped away. I see. You don't know.
He took off his hat and swept his arm against his chest in a low bow.
Then may I be the first to congratulate you on your pregnancy? I started back. My what?
He put his hat back on and chuckled.
Pregnant.
I believe you know who the father is. My mouth dropped open.
David.
Death nodded.
Yes.
As things stand, and as the rules of the death curse have been broken, I must send you back. I whipped my head up to stare at him.
I get to live again. He smiled and bowed his head. Precisely.
That is, unless you wish to remain on the floor of the junction.
I hurried to my feet and shook my head. No, I'll come. He swept his hand to a foggy spot to my left. Then let me be your guide to the world of the living. I have some unfinished business there to attend to.
8.
Our feet clacked loudly along the hard floor, as Death guided me into the foggy abyss.
I could barely see a foot in front of me, but Death's form never wavered beside me. I studied my companion.
You know, that death card shadow looked a lot more like Death than you do.
He arched an eyebrow, and the corners of his lips curled up.
Yes.
I will have to file a copyright infringement.
So how much do you know about me? I wondered. I mean, do you just know when and how I died? Life and death are both my specialties.
If I knew little about your life, then it would be harder to predict your death, he pointed out. I winced.
So you know everything about me. He chuckled. Your bedwetting secret is safe with me. I breathed a sigh of relief. Thanks, Mr. What do I call you? I prefer the name Mortimer.
I wanted to snort, but at that moment laughing in the face of death didn't sound like such a great idea.
So, Mortimer, how exactly are you going to bring me back to life?
Do I get to walk through some light or something?
Nothing so dramatic, I assure you, he replied.
Mortimer stopped and used his cane to point at the air in front of us. A round hole appeared in the fog, and expanded around us to sweep aside all the fog.
I turned in a full circle.
We stood in the cargo hold. Time also stood, but very still. Everything and everyone was frozen. Phoenix's stooges hung around the sidelines and close behind us, and to our right was David, still held by the stilted man, but I wasn't sure how long that would last. David was partially transformed into a werewolf, his face contorted by anger and his metamorphosis. In front of us stood Phoenix with a twisted look of triumph on his face. He still clutched the death card in his fist. Over his right shoulder hovered the fake death.
I turned to my left and my eyes widened.
Beside me lay my crumpled body.
I glanced at Mortimer. You can stop time too. He arched an eyebrow. Time?
That unusual way humans measure life?
It has no bearing on me.
We are merely at a point in lives, a memory that is the present.
I tapped my toes against my body.
My foot went through my solid form.
So how do I get back to being a part of life?
A sly smile slipped onto Mortimer's red lips.
Like this. He butted me with his cane. I fell forward into my body.
The world went black for a moment, and it felt like being slammed into a brick wall. I opened my eyes and gasped as my body kick-started itself into life.
I sat up and clutched my chest.
My heartbeat greeted me with a hard thump.
Dakota!
David shouted.
I twisted around and smiled at him. You won't believe what Death's real name is.
Phoenix stumbled back and his eyes widened.
What is this? You're supposed to be dead.
I whipped my head to our foe and glared at him.
Mortimer brought me back because you broke the cursed death rules, I told him as I climbed to my feet. He blinked at me. Mortimer!
Who are you talking about?
Me.
All eyes fell on the thin, black-clad figure who stood off to my left. Phoenix's troop, who stood near Mortimer, shrank away from his unnatural aura. Mortimer took a step towards us and tipped his top hat at our little group. Good evening, good gentlemen, and my dear new friend Dakota. Phoenix's face turned a ghastly white, and his mouth flopped open like a fish.
Are you here?
Mortimer chuckled.
Death.
I am glad you recognize me, Phoenix. We have had many mutual dealings, but I believe this is the first time we have had the pleasure of meeting face to face. Phoenix swallowed his stuttered.
What are you doing here, and why did you bring her back? He jabbed a finger at me.
Mortimer followed his finger and smiled at me.
It seems a few rules were broken when you sent her to me.
He returned his attention to Phoenix and his smile tensed. If you remember what the voodoo priest taught you, then you should know only one life can be taken by the curse. His eyes flickered to the shadow beside Phoenix, and his lips curled down in a frown.
And I greatly dislike my image being used. I did follow the rules. There was only her.
Phoenix insisted. Mortimer closed his eyes and shook his head.
I am afraid you're greatly mistaken.
His eyes flickered open and fell on Phoenix.
And it is a mistake that you will not make again.
Phoenix stumbled back as his eyes bulged out of his head.
No.
Please.
I'll do anything.
Mortimer strode towards him. His cane clacked against the hard floor.
You cannot deal with death, my old friend.
A death curse has been activated, and someone must be taken. Phoenix backed up against a large wooden crate. He pressed his palms against the side and shook his head.
No. Take one of them. He pointed at the troop.
Oliver stood near him and to one side. The man pointed at the young boy.
Take him. His soul would work.
Oliver glared at him.
You damn traitor.
Mortimer ignored Phoenix's offered substitutes, and stopped a foot from the trembling man. The mortal shrank from Death as Death's red eyes stared down at him. Death hovered his cane over Phoenix's chest.
Time to go.
Mortimer tapped Phoenix's chest with the top of his cane. Phoenix gave a horrible high-pitched cry before his eyes rolled back and he sank to the floor.
He didn't move.
The shadowy death-like creature groaned and shrank into nothing. The troop glanced at one another before they stepped away from us, and disappeared into the shadows of the hold. David hurried over to me and grasped my upper arms as he pressed me against his side. Mortimer turned to us with a smile and tipped his hat.
A long and happy life to the three of you. And that is a promise.
I blinked, and Mortimer vanished.
I turned my head to and fro. Mortimer?
David shook his head.
Don't try looking for death.
You'll only get into the same trouble as Phoenix.
I looked up and frowned at him. Speaking of trouble, there's something I need to talk to you about. He smiled down at me. I know.
You're pregnant.
I blinked at him. You knew.
David set a hand on my stomach and chuckled.
You forget that I have a very sensitive nose. I smelled the change in your body yesterday.
My mouth dropped open.
And when were you going to tell me? After all this trouble was blown over, he replied.
He looked past me at Oliver, and nodded his head in the direction of the young boy.
And we have Oliver to thank for getting us out of it. I furrowed my brow and looked to Oliver. Him. But he betrayed us.
Oliver cringed.
Only for a little while, and only because it's what he nodded at David, told me to do.
David chuckled.
And you performed your part perfectly.
I doubt Phoenix ever suspected you had changed your allegiances. I pointed at Oliver.
But you called Phoenix a traitor.
Oliver smiled and shrugged.
I learned from the best. And you're an excellent student, David spoke up. I turned to David and frowned. But how'd you know he was working with Phoenix?
David shrugged. Anyone who could climb such precarious heights wasn't a normal stowaway orphan. Besides that, I could smell the lingering odor of face paint from him. Oliver crossed his arms and studied us.
Speaking of thanks, you'd better keep your end of our deal.
David smiled and nodded.
You get a free ride until you're of age, but I won't let you waste that attentive mind of yours. Once we're on land, you get to go to school.
Oliver frowned but shrugged.
Fine, but don't expect much. School ain't my style. So, are you adopting him?
I guessed. David looped his arm around me and smiled.
We're adopting him. That is, after the wedding.
I cringed.
Just promise me we won't be going on a cruise for the real honeymoon. He chuckled. That is something I can definitely promise you.
9. David and I stood outside the balcony.
The twinkling stars of midnight hung over us.
Behind us in the living room lay Oliver fast asleep on the couch.
The time was a few hours after our.
David looped his arm around my waist and smiled at me.
Now that our pre-honeymoon is over, what do you say? I pressed a finger against his lips. The next time you suggest we go anywhere for any reason, remind me to say no, I instructed him. He chuckled. And miss out on all this excitement? I straightened and glared at him. You think it's fun meeting death?
I could formally introduce you to him. David smiled and rubbed my stomach.
I doubt he would be so merciful to me, or find such a loophole for myself.
I leaned away from him and studied his face.
Speaking of death, how'd you know I wasn't going to be permanently killed by that curse?
David looked back over his shoulder and nodded at Oliver.
He told me the details of the curse, and from a short phone call with Kosho I guessed the rest, though Phoenix's demise was a pleasant surprise.
My eyebrows crashed down.
You guessed with my life.
He recoiled from my anger.
Maybe.
I pressed my hands on his chest and tried to push him away.
That's it. The wedding's off.
No more sexy time for a naughty wolf like you. David laughed and wrapped both arms around me.
It's not that easy, my mate.
When werewolves choose a mate, they choose them for life.
That means you're stuck with me.
A sly grin slid onto my lips.
No, that means you're stuck with me.
I aimed my knee for his family jewels, but he leaned down and captured my lips in a hot, passionate kiss.
I pulled us apart and glared at him. Why'd you have to be so sexy? He chuckled. It's just a gift. I sighed and leaned against his chest. I suppose I can live with that gift.
And I happily did, for a long, long, long time.